Can you hear me?
No one's answering.
Nobody can hear me.
The delay.
Yeah, somebody said yes.
Yeah. Okay. Can you guys hear Raph? Sexy Raph is what they're calling you now. Can you guys hear Raph? Hey, you can hear everybody. Okay, perfect. There we go. I did it. Yes. All right.
Good job, Shane.
Yeah. You know, I'm not just another pretty face like Raph. So, here we've this is Raph Koster at the bottom left. Give a wave. You know, you guys know Epi. He's in the middle there, in the New York hat. And then you got Joe B at the top left. You got me at the top right. You got Pat middle right, and Faye at the bottom right. So some of our faces are a little more familiar. Raph is not Lord Blackthorn, by the way. That's Starlong. I'm reading this as we go. So basically, what we're gonna do here. Raph is he's gonna do some jousting. This whole jousting event will start here in the Knights Guild. You guys all know about them in UO Forever here. They're gonna be running their jousting event here as we're taking questions and everything, and then we're gonna get Raph to do some jousting. So if you wanna joust against Raph, you can PM the PM Sir in Discord there, and he can probably throw you in, hopefully, unless there's a ton of people.
And I've never done it before, so you have excellent odds of winning.
The whole roll of the dice odds.
I beefed up. He's gonna win.
So with that, if you guys have questions you have for him, I think there's going to be a while here. Like Raph actually has been in this. We've been in this Zoom meeting here for what, hour and a half or something. And he's been showing us stuff, and we're like, wait. I'm like, wait. And,
yeah, save
it for everybody, because he has some just unreal relics and some stuff in his house there from the original like UO map, all like the cloth map, all sorts of stuff. Some really stuff that nobody else has really, and I'm not sure if you guys know, but he has a lot more to do with UO than, you know, a lot of other people out there. Like he was just telling us he actually handcrafted Trinsic, the city, by tile. Like he did it all himself. And then he, you know, so not only was he a developer, but he also had a creative, you know, not only did he write code, but he had a creative side, or has a creative side to him too, which is awesome. Did Faye send you those questions there of everybody?
Yep.
Okay. Your camera's frozen. I don't know why. Nice Tentry hat, by the way.
Thanks.
You guys can hear, if everybody says hello really quick, I just want to make sure everybody can hear you on stream. So Joe B, you can say hi.
Hi.
And Epi.
Hey, guys.
Raph.
Hi.
And Faye.
Hey.
And Pat.
Yep.
Okay. Everybody can hear you. Okay. So I think we'll just we'll take some questions right now, and the Sir Guild, if you guys want to get on just starting your jousting right now, and that can happen as we watch that. And if you guys have questions in sorry, my dog's whining on my lap here. He thinks I'm talking to him. But if you guys have any questions for Raph as we're, you know, doing all this, feel free to ask him on Twitch or in Discord to any of the staff. So, or page in with it. Sound good?
I see a question about fenders.
Yeah.
Those aren't fenders. Those are Gibsons.
Yeah, they're Gibsons.
Actually, those are inheritances from my father-in-law, and they are actually vintage 1961 Gibsons.
Wow.
So they're old. However, the banjo next to them is actually 125 years old, so it's even older.
Yeah, that's a relic.
Completely still playable though.
Prove it.
Yeah. An hour log of Raph. Ding, 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 ding.
You really want to lead the stream with guitar playing?
125-year-old banjo playing, maybe.
Yeah. It's Let's rock this
Now,
joint.
there's a UO question. That's a good one. Should I answer questions out of Twitch chat?
If you want to, I'm sure there's going to be some stuff said in there that isn't exactly awesome, but we got some people moderating it, so go ahead,
right.
answer.
I'll answer the quickie one for the UO Forever theme song. No, I have no idea what that is. I used to be able to play Stones. You could hear it on the radio at the beginning of Ultima 9, but I haven't played it in years. The favorite contribution to UO. Here's the thing. I don't think people know how much of UO I made, so it's very hard to pick. My wife, Kristen, and I were the original designers on UO, and we did everything related to the crafting is something that we brought to the game. Everything related to the pets, everything related to the game economy, except for the player vendors edition, that was somebody else. But all of the crafting related stuff, all of the economy, Kristen did the original balancing for every single one of the numbers, for every monster and everything else, all the damage numbers. We didn't do the spells, but we did do most of the skills. I personally wrote most of the bardic stuff. Every time you take out a bladed item and you chop a tree or cut a hide, I wrote that script. When wisps talk or orcs go oog, ag, ag, I did that. And if you found the book in the game that gave you the syllabary for the Orcish language, I wrote all of those books. I wrote nearly all of the books, actually. Here in the stream, just from imagery that I see on the screen, those cute little red flowers and the candles that are sitting on the table, I drew those. I drew that potted tree that's in the back there next to the fellow in the orange robe. Yeah, you, the one who just said, wow, that's right. Well, now there's what is that, a wyvern standing on you? Yeah, so pretty much actually almost all of the little flowers and just about all the jungle flora, except for the big giant trees, was me. Every time you go up a set of stairs or walk under an arch, that was me, because I did all of the technical design for the arches and for the stairs. The technical artist wasn't quite sure how to make them work. We didn't expect people to be riding horses and ostriches up them, though, like you're doing down in the corner there. And I actually brought with me to the stream the original sketchbooks for all of that stuff, so you can actually see how they were done. But we can get to that in a minute. So it's really, really hard for me to pick a favorite thing. It might be pets. It might be being able to play an instrument at all. It might be player housing. Jason Spangler and I put player housing in over a weekend because Richard had ordered us not to. And he wanted us to do boats. And we said, but boats and houses are the same thing, technically. So we did both of them. And Jason's first pass prototype was a flying carpet. So that might be one of the big ones. But yeah, I mean, I did an awful lot of UO. And I was credited for art. I was credited for design. I was also credited for programming, not because of all of the game scripts, but if you open your paper doll and you see it says your name and apprentice or dreadlord or whatever, I wrote the title system in the client code too. Client and server. So yeah, lots. Hard for me to pick a favorite. So yeah, that question, now you've asked like 50 since I answered that one. I'll have to scroll back.
We had a submitted question, and it basically what you were saying about your wife, so it's kind of ties into that. So one question from our community was, I've heard you mention your wife and how much she did on UO as well during its development. Have you ever considered going back to the humble roots of her work to reformulate a new game using today's technology?
Well, I have more than once.
Perfect.
Right. So the thing to understand is that she and I and the lead programmer of UO, Rick Dellerschmidt, who is Let's see. Can you see that? I got to see if I can hold this in the right place here. So you see this photo. The guy in the middle is Rick Delaschmidt. He wrote 80% of the Ultima Online client and server. The guy kind of under my fingers is Todd Mckinney. He's out of the game industry now. But Todd was also a friend of ours. In fact, in this time period, he probably lived at our house still. Todd and Rick and my wife and I were all immortals on a text mud called Legend Mud. So UO has an enormous amount of Legend Mud in it. Like 4 of us on the original early team were from Legend Mud. And Kristen and I, Rick had been the original programmer of Legend Mud as well. And Chris and I, during the time that we were building UO, were actually the 2 people in charge of it. When we applied to work at Origin, it was because Rick recommended us for the job. He had just landed the job a few months before and had begun building a prototype built off of Ultima 6 that was getting called Multima. This is the original sign from the prototype team. This hung in the hallway pointing the way to where we worked. And he recommended us in, and Todd came along a little bit later. So we were actually working on Legend and UO at the same time. Our job applications had in them design ideas that were the basis for the in-game ecology, the fact that UO has all of the crafting stuff and the AI and all of that stuff came from our job applications. We didn't even know when we walked in to the office, we asked, so what's the game we're going to make? And they said, it's going to be great. And they told us all about the stuff in our application. So we didn't know that the game was actually being based on what we made. Kristen worked on UO, but that was the last game that she did in the game industry. We had a couple of kids. She kept running Legend Mud until sometime in the early 2000s, actually. But the underlying ideas of player-driven economy, player governments, you know, all of those kinds of concepts ended up making it into Star Wars Galaxies. The idea of empowering players, I later did a platform called MetaPlace. That was very much a part of it. So yeah, she was my original design partner, and I still bounce ideas off of her all the time. So yeah, her influence is still there, even though she left the industry around 1998, somewhere around there.
That's great. Here's one here we got from Asherin. And what was one thing that you were unable to implement that you would like UO Forever to attempt to do so?
Well, I don't know if UO Forever has these features or not. So
we can tell you.
Yeah, let's see. Probably my biggest missed regret in UO was Townstones. This would have been the ability for players to go beyond guilds, found actual towns that then they could define the laws within the towns. So they could hold elections for mayor, decide whether or not it was PvP or safe area, set up the laws, set up their own spawn points, taverns, banks, and effectively run a whole town from scratch. And that never made it into UO. But we did put it in Galaxies, and it was a pretty popular feature, Player Cities in there. Other things, gosh, I mean, the underlying system to UO, there was a point where we talked about having rust monsters. You know, all of your stuff that is made of metal was actually made of metal behind the scenes. And we talked about burning down forests, having rust monsters actually rust your stuff, having real weather, snow accumulation. There's even things that we had and had to take out, like NPC schedules. You know, we took those out really early on because players complained, why is it that the shops are all closed at night, right? So yeah, there's just tons of stuff like that, that UO was meant to be a fully simulated fantasy world, right? And most of the limitations were because at the time, a computer to run UO on had like a fraction of the power of what you've got in your pocket for your cell phone, right? It probably has less power than your smartwatch, to be honest. So there's a lot we just couldn't do.
Awesome. This is a cool one. Was cow tipping your idea?
You know, I'm not sure. It was either me or Rick, maybe Scott Phillips, one of us. But yeah, I mean, we did a lot of little Easter eggs like that. There were still Vorpal bunnies running around because during the alpha, critters actually learned skills from using, just like players did. And bunnies leveled up to the point where they could take out wolves, which meant they could take out a lot of players too. And we actually then implemented them directly into the game later on, after we took out the ability for players to for monsters to learn. That's also why there were occasionally purple llamas that spawned instead of energy vortexes. Yeah, we put in a lot of Easter eggs like that.
Yeah,
But cow tipping was definitely one of those.
Yeah, I like the how stealable rares became a thing, where it was just regular statics, but you guys forgot to lock them down, and people took them.
Yeah,
really
that's
like
pretty
that
much
idea.
exactly what happened.
Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah, you know, the game had streaming bits and non-streaming bits, and the streaming parts were minimal on purpose. You know, it's everything in player houses and players and stuff dropped on the ground. And we had to limit how much of that there was. Walking around Britain would have been a DDoS attack otherwise on your poor connection, because we were designing for a 14.4 modem, right? If you're on a cable modem right now, you have something like 2,700 times the bandwidth that we had to work with for a 14.4 modem. And your ping time is probably at least 10 times faster, right? So just dropping too much stuff on the ground could knock you offline. So we couldn't stream Britain. We had to ship it on the CD. So as we were building, we had this toggle, which was things to stream, which were called dynamics, and things that we will put on the CD, which were called statics. And these are the things that live in the .mul file, right, when you install the game. And it was super, super easy to accidentally build an entire freaking city as dynamics, and then afterwards go, oh shit, have to demolish it all and rebuild it a tile at a time. So stuff would get missed. Sometimes it was a candelabra on a table, and sometimes it was a patch of water. And because all the behaviors were attached to the objects as long as they were dynamic, that meant that if you had a dynamic patch of water, you could fish out of it, even if it was in your backpack. So patches of water were the first popular rare item. People would grab them the minute the server booted up and steal them and put them in their backpacks so that they could fish out of them anywhere or fill the jugs of water for cooking or whatever. And then they started scavenging around for the rares. They'd get replaced when the server booted. So the minute the server booted, an army of people would go all over the server, going to all the known locations of dynamic spawns of things that weren't supposed to be dynamic. And people started selling them on eBay. And that was actually the birth of free-to-play and real money trade stuff, right? Because before that, nobody realized, oh, we could be selling this stuff directly for real money. And gradually, that's how it started. That's where gold farming came from. People realized they could make just more money off of farming gold than off of farming rares.
So is that like I know Richard has talked about this, about like how you guys were kind of concerned about like money laundering through the game. Basically, do you want to elaborate more on that?
Back then, so you have to understand that a lot of the stuff about the internet wasn't settled yet. Under the law back then, the internet was equivalent to a phone line. So that meant, for example, that logging chat on the internet might fall under wiretapping law. It meant that transacting with virtual goods could technically mean that you were a bank and you would have to sign up as banking law, right? Sign up to be a financial institution. We just didn't know. And a lot of that stuff gradually developed over time. But yeah, there was a huge amount of concern around the legal liability for those things back then.
Yeah, I always found that really interesting. Okay, so I really like this question. This is from Weezart. In the early 2000s, most of the people from the video game industry were saying that the biggest mistake Ultima Online made was the player killing stuff. Allowing players to kill other players and loot their stuff was ruining the game. But I remember you at a game developer conference in San Jose saying that you disagree with that statement. Is that still the case?
It's complicated. So just to do some context, right? The original sales forecasts for UO were like 15 to 35,000 units, lifetime. EA thought the game would shut down after 6 months. That's part of why they greenlit a UO2 sequel. The beta test got like 50,000 people sending in money for the disc, right? First early access in history, as far as I know, where they needed, we needed to give them a disc, and we didn't even have the budget to make and ship the discs, right? So that right there was like 50,000. The game comes out, and it becomes the fastest selling game EA had ever had to date. And it sells hundreds of thousands of copies. But as we all know, it was incredibly janky. Lots of people couldn't connect. It was so bad, actually, that this happened, right? This was a lawsuit by a former Legend Mud player who followed us from Legend Mud and started a class action lawsuit against EA. And he was a problem player over there, too. So the game was really janky, and players were getting player killed left and right. We lost hundreds of thousands of players to player killing in the first year. Like, UO at the time broke 100,000 subscribers pretty quickly. When EverQuest came out, EverQuest eventually got several 100,000, like 275K or something, in 99, and was bigger than UO. If UO had not had player killing, it would have been bigger than EverQuest by a bunch at that point. We lost a lot of players to player killing. On the other hand, in the process of trying to take player killing out, we did probably 7 systems to try to reduce player killing: notoriety, murder counts, ping pong counts, order chaos shields and virtue guards, the young system. I could go on and on, right? But of course, the final result was Trammel. And Trammel killed a lot of what made UO special. And EverQuest and player killing switches, basically being able to opt out of PK altogether, also killed a lot of what made UO special. So we were trying to thread a needle, right? We were trying to make a game that had the freedom, but didn't just gank everybody. And it came down to a choice between freedom and everybody getting ganked. And what happened, Trammel, and in fact all the later games for quite a while, not until EVE Online, they all made the choice to provide player safety instead of freedom. To this day, when you ask people what their favorite memories are of UO, they might lead with Lord British getting player killed. They'll tell stories about thievery, stories about murder, stories about house break-ins. They tell stories that were actually horrible for the victims at the time. But those are the memories that people have. That's the things people remember and love about UO. And so it's a trade-off that I wish we hadn't made. I've been revisiting a lot of this lately because you know, the choice was basically between having a civil environment and having an environment with freedoms in it. And the goal was, we thought of ourselves as being at the forefront of the internet, not just games, right? At the time, virtual worlds were going to be the way the internet developed, you know, Ready Player One, Snow Crash, whatever, right? And so we explicitly thought ourselves as solving a real problem, right? Something that over time needed to be dealt with. How do we have an internet with freedom and with civility? And my worry is that we not only didn't solve it, but games gave up on trying to solve it. And today we have an internet that doesn't have freedom or civility. You know, you look at Twitter, and if you're running something like a PK switch, that means you're signing up to moderate. And instead, what we have is an unmoderated internet where everybody ganks, right? So to speak. It's full of different kinds of harassment. It's full of different kinds of bad behavior. So, yeah, I wish we had managed to solve it another way. But the minute Trammel went in, over the next 6 months, the population of UO doubled. So was player killing a problem? Hell yeah. A massive one.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have that exact challenge.
Yeah.
And again, like you said, it's what makes UO, and it's really hard to go that far right, like you said with Trammel.
Yeah, that's actually how I discovered myself, why you guys introduced Trammel. I knew right then. I was like, wow, I guarantee you back in the day they were losing subs left, right, and center. And they're like, wow, how can we fix this? Because we have the same issue. I look at the numbers. I'm the market guy. I get people here. And I look at the people going out the back door because they're getting PK'd, grief, stuff like that. And it's like, well, you know, it just right away it clicked. And I was like, yeah, that's why they did Trammel. Not that, just so everybody knows watching, we're not going to put in Trammel. Okay.
Well, one thing, one thing about that is that today the audience is way larger too, right? And the result of that is you're not trying to squeeze all the playstyles into one game. And back then we had to find ways to have different playstyles coexist. And we thought it was super important to have different playstyles coexist. Now you can have a Fortnite and a PUBG for the player killers, or an EVE for the player killers, right alongside a Second Life for the builder creator types, and the UOs and the EverQuests and the World of Warcrafts and so on, and people can go find the game that suits them. But it used to be that you tried to design for all of those kinds of players to be in one game, because otherwise your game couldn't afford to run. You wouldn't have enough players to pay for operation.
Do games still have that like minimum requirement thing on the box?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they still do.
Sure.
Okay, so actually this kind of works well with what you were just discussing. So this is a question from Sir. What do you feel are the most important aspects of an MMORPG experience?
I've always defined MMOs as be someone you can't be, someplace that you can't go with other people. That to me is the heart of what a virtual world is about. And, there's a lot of ways to do that, right? But to me, the heart of the MMOs is offering that you can't really quite do in the real world, doing it with other people and doing it, a place you couldn't possibly be, often not as yourself, right? From the very beginning of MUDs, the text-based predecessors to virtual worlds, things like, playing people who aren't anything like you, including cross-gender roleplay and stuff like that, was going on from the very, very beginning. And actually, the original designer of Mud put that kind of thing in on purpose. Even though back then you showed your real name next to your character, he made a point of doing things like playing characters that weren't what he was like in real life in order to get across to people, hey, this gives you complete freedom to explore what someone can be. And so to me, that's still at the heart of the whole thing, right? In my personal case, I really value building online communities, right? I really value that aspect of it. But there's lots of ways in which you can do that. Sometimes it can be immersive, sometimes not. I don't care that much. I'm a big fan of all kinds of virtual worlds.
So you touched a little bit on this earlier, but this is a question from Decoy. From a technical standpoint, what was the most challenging aspect to Ultima Online in implementing it? I imagine, like you said, the modem thing, right? The bandwidth
that's
thing.
one example.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard to look back now and realize how insane UO is.
Mazer.
From a technical point of view, right? There were virtual worlds, MMOs going on with peak numbers from 150 to 250 in one world. UO did 2,500 to 3,000. That meant we had to solve something. We had to basically build computing clusters. That was not really a thing. What we call cloud computing was not a thing. Our networking budget was minuscule. We had to hand tune packets, network packets, down to the byte. And we had a budget of 400 bytes per second. That literally, if you go in today to a limited population thing, like a modern FPS, they will blow that budget by like a factor of 10 to 100 and not think anything of it. There are more objects on screen right now than there are in an entire Battlefield match today, right? Easily. That are streamed down and dynamic. And that kind of thing, you know, the sheer volume of what we were trying to do in terms of streaming was new and had never been done. The term database sharding comes because Mundane broke the gem of immortality into crystal shards. And today, when DBAs talk about sharding a database, they use that word because of the fiction that we wrote. The running shards on different continents. We were one of the first large-scale uses of VPN in history. We couldn't ship binaries out to servers because the servers were running different operating systems. We had some of them that were running Linux, some of them that were running Solaris, and so on. We developed on Linux in the office. So we actually shipped the source code out to the different machines via FTP in an automated process over VPN and compiled the servers remotely at each of the server locations, at each of the different shard locations. So we had to pioneer an enormous amount of networking technology. I remember when they came to install the first T1s and T3s and had to rip up the road outside the office because until then, that wasn't something that you ran to an office building. So, yeah, I mean, I think we didn't realize how much of a moonshoot we were engaged in. Because most of us, you know, we had Michael Priest. He was already, to our mind, old. You know, Richard was our executive producer. But everybody else on the team, I think the average age was 23. The youngest people on the team had just finished high school and were 17 and 18 years old. I was 23 or 24 when I became creative lead of UO. So, yeah, we were a bunch of young punk kids who had no idea that we were proposing to do the impossible. So we did it.
Yeah, I love that. One quick question. I saw it in Twitch chat. What language was it coded in?
Mostly vanilla C. There was a little bit of C++ scattered around, but it was almost all in plain old C. Most of the programmers at Origin used Visual Studio and used, Visual Studio and C, but they were Windows programmers, right? And that wasn't the case for all of us who came over from MUDs. So on like my second day of work, there were a bunch of guys who'd done the prototype stuff on the Ultima 6 engine with Rick, Ken Demarest, Jim Greer. Jim went on, by the way, to found Congregate. But Jim and I overlapped for like all of a week at Origin. He quit like right after we all got there. And he sits down at the PC to show me where the paths are to various things. So we sit down at the DOS prompt and start navigating around. And I start typing and he stops me and points at my forward slashes as I'm typing the paths. And he goes, "That's backslash, Unix boy." Because I was used to working in Unix. On the text MUDs, we did everything in Unix. And virtually all of our programming, including on UO, was done in VI. And our compiling was mostly done with command line GCC. All of us ran UO servers on Linux at our desktop. We all had 2 computers at our desk and 2 monitors, one for the server machine, so we could run a private server for building, and one for the Windows client. So yeah, Vanilla C mostly developed in Unix. For the game code, the server was written in C. The game logic, anything that wasn't speed dependent, meaning things that weren't the combat system, pathfinding, core AI, chatting, that kind of stuff, was written in the internal scripting language called Wombat. And Wombat basically looked like C. There were, I forget exactly, about 100,000 lines of code in the server and the client in C, 100 to 200,000 lines of code there. And Wombat, there were another 200 to 500,000 lines of Wombat code. So every interactive object, every most of the spells, most of the skills, all of the crafting, the pet system, harvesting fruit from trees, you name it. All of that stuff was written in Wombat. Oh, and databases. We used flat text files.
Yeah.
For player files and for sourcing the creature stats, because actual databases were too slow at the time. So flat text files was the way to do it.
I think there's still aspects of the game that we use that are text-based because of the, like you said, the speed.
Yep.
What inspired you to get into the game development business? Were you influenced by any earlier games and something just clicked one day? Were there any pressure in the business to try to push out new concepts to compete with EverQuest? And that's a question from Zarzak.
That's 2 separate questions. I started developing games when I was 13 or so, inspired in part by the games that I was playing, which included things like Ultima 3. I'd heard the story of Richard selling his games like a Calabeth in Ziploc baggies. So when I was 13 or 14, I actually did sell video games to my classmates in Ziploc baggies. But I didn't think I would end up in the game industry. I used to do board games until I learned how to program. So I started probably doing tabletop games when I was, I don't know, 10 or 11, and kind of never stopped. And then fell out of it when Windows and whatnot came along. When the Mac came along, I stopped doing programming because all of the the GUI stuff really got in the way of just plain old doing programming, right? It added all of this stuff you had to go learn. So we ended up not doing games. I just stopped until text muds, and that's what got me back into game programming. So I got back into it around 1992, 93. And then, yeah, text muds is how I got back into it. What was the second half of the question again?
Oh yeah, was there any pressure in the business to try and push out new content to compete with EverQuest?
Sure. I mean, EverQuest, in particular, stuff like stuff against PvP, adding more of an item-driven game. I think that was in response to pressure from EverQuest and WoW. The original philosophy from UO is not at all item-driven. But you know, you play the modern UO game, and in terms of those mechanics, I don't even recognize them. Right? It's just not an item or equipment driven game originally. Gear was totally disposable. So yeah, those things. Increased emphasis on classes, right? You know, even the way you start up in UO Forever, you choose from prepackaged, not classes, but prepackaged templates, right? And that was actually a system I designed for Second Age. And it was because we found too many newbies too confused when they came in. It was too directionless, having 40 plus skills to choose from. So there were a lot of things that we were doing to try to, you know, get the intro experience more navigable for a newbie. And, you know, UO2, of course, went 3D. There were some, you know, there was talk about could we take UO 3D. There wasn't a ton of expertise inside of Origin to do 3D, as is evidenced by Ultima 9. Sorry, guys. Which to this day doesn't work well in 3D, even on a modern video card. So there wasn't enough experience in the company to really know how to do it. A few years later, there were a few, you know, there were a few efforts by fans to make 3D clients, but it never really totally panned out, I think, which is too bad. There's still some stuff by players who've written custom clients where you could fly around UO in 3D, and it's pretty awesome. So,
how often did EverQuest come up in like day-to-day operations? Like I know, like nowadays you look at like PUBG and how many copycat games are coming off of that, and I mean PUBG was even a copycat game, and that blew up. Like it was before like H1Z1 was there. Like how often did it come up? Like, and did you guys like not necessarily I want to say copy their material, but maybe borrow it?
Oh, it didn't really work that way. So you had management, and then you had people on the team. Management watched EverQuest and said, oh no, it's going to be 3D. Oh no, it's first person. Wow, this is awesome and immersive. But wow, they're getting married to this brand new Glide API with this brand new video card company called 3DFX that we don't know if that will succeed or not. And they're making it hardware only. That's insanely risky, right? I mean, you have to realize they caught a wave, that the Variant guys, because it was before Sony, they caught the wave and decided to get married to the hardware accelerated 3D gaming. And they were one of the first games to make that choice. That's why something like Ultima 9 didn't work. It was mostly software rendered. So management was looking at it that way. The team was hanging out on a mailing list called MudDev. The MudDev mailing list had been running since 1994 and had on it the developers who created The Realm, Tibia, Dark Ages, Lineage, Meridian 59, Ultima Online, EverQuest, Ashram's Call, and we all told each other all of our ideas all the time, and were completely open about everything that we were doing. and you can still find the archives of the MudDev mailing list out there. I host a mirror of them on my website. There are mirrors of them several other places. We would get together at GDC, hold dinners, swap ideas. We ran our own conference parallel to GDC. We'd meet at Il Fornaio and at Tesque's Germania in San Jose. We would hire each other, and we were all friends. So it wasn't so much that, oh, are we copying ideas or anything like that? Shit, we were in each other's alphas. We were all friends. It was not the same. It was not like how people think of it today with like, oh, let's clone. That's not how it worked. It was a very, very different environment. And there were, not that many people making massively multiplayer games. All of us started making them all around the same time. Pretty much all of those games I just mentioned were launched as projects between 94 and 96. They just finished after different amounts of time. So EverQuest started around the same time UO did. Lineage started around the same time UO did. The guys who founded Meridian 59 logged onto Legend Mud and offered me a job. And I said, I can't. I just took a job with Origin. But tell you what, there's this guy named Damien Schubert. And Damien went and worked at Meridian 59. And of course, Damien went on to work on Shadowbane and Star Wars The Old Republic. And the guy who'd logged on to offer the job was Mike Sellers. And Mike Sellers went on to do Meridian 59 and later Realm of the Mad God. And, to this day, these are still the people who drive MMOs. That guy who started Lineage went on to be, that was TJ Kim and Jake Song, and they founded Next Song, and they founded NCSoft, right? So we were all friends. We all knew each other, and we all swapped ideas all the time. We were a club. We were a scene, and we all gave each other jobs. When Damien left there, we hired him over on UO, and he was named lead on UO2. Right?
Huh.
That's what it was like.
That's a lot of information nobody knows.
Yeah.
That's some
Game
pretty
studies
good stuff.
people know
it.
it.
It's
all
good.
of that stuff is out there.
Yeah. People play these games, but they don't, game studies people definitely would know that. But, that's good. That's awesome. I was going to ask you, somebody just brought it up. Are you going to TwitchCon?
I don't know. I don't think so. Is it? I didn't even go the year it was in San Diego, where I live.
I've never been. We have a ton of our players. All of a sudden, it's kind of becoming a roundup here. We got streamers and stuff that are all going. And they're asking me to go. And then somebody just asked if you're going here, and
I don't even know
they
where
just
it
said
is.
you should speak. You should speak at it, but
Oh, well.
like at a podium. That would be interesting.
Yeah.
I think people would be really interested in that, but that's a whole nother thing, I guess. But
I do the thing where I speak at a podium around a half dozen times a year.
do you? Okay.
Yes.
Just so you guys know, you can go to raphkoster.com, and he's got a ton of information, like the timelines of the. I actually mentioned that to you, Raph, about how much I love your timelines of, just the internet timeline of things, basically, and it tells you how I actually didn't even know that EverQuest was launched at the same time as UO. I didn't know that. I thought it
as
came
a
much
dev
after.
project, yeah.
Yeah, I thought it came much after. So that's a lot of information on there. You guys can definitely check out. But yeah, with the Twitch thing, I don't know. My players are bugging me to go, and then I thought about, man, it would be pretty cool if we got the whole staff to go as a little vacation or something. But yeah, we'll have to see.
Yeah, when we first showed at E3 in Atlanta, showing the alpha or whatever. Yes, E3, the first couple were in Atlanta. We found EverQuest and Ashron's Call out there on the floor, and we all hung out together. So, yeah. It's funny how times have changed, and how some of those folks have now been friends of mine for over 20 years.
You said you're in San Diego?
Yep.
Apparently it's in San Jose.
Yep. Yeah. Not surprised.
Yeah. All right. So, if you were to change one aspect of the game, would you change anything?
I'd probably have started out more aggressive on the player killing stuff and loosened it over time, rather than starting loose and then have had to tighten it. Right. It would have been equally, you know, it would have taken equally as long, but it might not have been as excruciating for the players.
When housing was implemented, what do you think you would have done different from what you know now? Housing always felt like one of those things people would have had a lot of different views on, and that's from Ghost 1001.
When we started out with housing, because we were houses were built out of the individual tiles, all attached to a master object, but they were kind of atomic. They didn't have the notion of this is how big I am when we first implemented them. So they didn't know what size they were. They didn't know this position is inside the house, this isn't. That is why early houses used the key system rather than house ownership. That's why you couldn't ban people from houses at first. We didn't know where the outer edge of the wall was. So that was the kind of thing that that we didn't have. And I do wish that we had had that stuff, because it would have simplified a whole bunch of things. All of the house break-in crap that happened, you know, we kept having to say houses aren't secure because they weren't, but we weren't able to make them secure because we didn't have enough technical infrastructure behind them. And that was because we built them over a weekend. We implemented, you know, all of housing over the weekend using a new technology we called multi-obj, which basically said one dynamically streamed object can point at a larger set of objects that we spawn on the client and on the server simultaneously in parallel with known offsets. That is how boats and houses both work. So think one spawner that spawns a whole bunch of extra stuff with it. And that parent object keeps track of all of the things. So multi-obj technology is the thing that that we put in all at once over that weekend, because Richard had told the public we would have boats with naval battles, and then told us, but don't do housing. And we went ahead and did housing anyway, because we thought it was super important. So yeah, if we'd had the technical infrastructure, people wouldn't have been able to walk up to the roof and fall in. People wouldn't have been able to steal a key out of a backpack and literally take everything about your house, right? Yeah, it would have been nice to have had that sooner.
Yeah, I think, like, as I'm seeing in Twitch chat, a lot of people are loving, like, the house break-ins, sneaking into houses, looting their houses dry. I mean, I loved that back in the day. And I know that, like...
You didn't love it happening to you.
That's true, but don't trust anyone, right? That's the #1 rule in UO.
Yeah, that's kind of the trade-off, right?
Yeah.
It was great for anybody who aggressed. It wasn't in what was going on. It was fine. But if they did get emotionally invested, it was a problem. And that's how eventually things like house lockdowns started showing up. We were getting things like role players building popular locations like taverns in player cities. Enchu Ponfar's City of You, Kazola's Tavern, things like that. The where were the sporting events, like the wrestling events held? I forget. Was that outside of Skara Brae, maybe? I don't remember. Wherever those were.
The Gelholm Pits?
There was the Gelholm Pit. Yeah, so there were actually a bunch, right? So all of those kinds of things, normally people would have just been able to steal all of it. Instead, what happened is we had admins in-game go in and lock down the objects tile by tile, wall by wall, because we wanted to support the role players. Because otherwise, it was like dropping, you know, dropping a wonderful set of gorgeous role players into a piranha pit. The piranhas would just eat them alive and everything would be destroyed in no time. So we started offering that support, and it was manual and it was incredibly expensive, right? Like it took hours to lock down that shit. And so that's why we started adding more and more of the automated support, because the role-playing stuff was amazing. Golden Brew players going on tour, doing theater, the birth of Shadow Clan, right? The orcs who started with one role player who started using the orcish language that was in that stupid little book I wrote, and they ran with it, right? So we gave them the orc fort, turned off the orc spawns, and said, go nuts, it's yours now.
You wrote
right?
the orc language?
I wrote the orc language, the wisp language, they're all the same language script, actually. The way all of those work is there's a set of syllables that each of them use, and each of the languages has a typical syllable word length, like how many syllables per word, and then it inserts spaces randomly, inserts punctuation randomly, and there's a library of actual English words that it salts in randomly, and it also listened to people chatting and would periodically steal words out of their chat and repeat them. And out of that, an entire guild called Seekers of the Wisps was born, who thought that wisps healed people, guided them to shrines, and understood and had AI. And it was all actually randomly generated gibberish. But that's where the orcish stuff came from, and to this day, they use elements of that orcish stuff when they roleplay. Like when you see your people in WoW talking about hues, those are still children of Shadow Clan today, right? So yeah, that's where that stuff was born.
Yeah, we actually have some of them here that play. We have the role play.
Hoo-ah!
Yeah. They run around stealthing around, and then they just like instantly kill people with like, because there's so many of them, hey, and they'll stealth. And when we actually changed, it wasn't like this back in the day, is before, if you were part of the same guild or party, you couldn't see your party who was stealthing around, but we made it so you can see your party, so you can actually set up stealth attacks and like surround them slowly, you know. And with voice over IP and stuff, you can synchronize your bow shots, and you know it's a lot of fun for these guys.
Yeah, the original orc caught us all by surprise. It was before there were some really hideous old-looking orcs still in the art set, and then there were the new fancy green orcs. And we had these orc masks at first. So Shadow Clan started out using the orc masks to roleplay. It actually started with one person who came out of the forest in Trinsic and started role-playing, talking about how he was an orc and orcs were intelligent and you shouldn't kill them all. And this was partly based on some of the in-game books. There's a set of interconnected in-game books which are about Japheth, the paladin of Trinsic, and I can't remember her name, but she was kidnapped by the orcs and raised by them. And I think, you know, there's this little set of books. It was one of the Easter eggs. If you found all of those books, you could piece the story together. And so this role player ran with it. So we added polymorphing to orcs, and then we added the better looking orc stuff. And then we removed the orc spawns from the orc fort so that they could take over. That was actually how that started.
Huh.
Yeah, I really like the unintentional things that made UO. Like, I mean, that's what a lot of people.
That's what makes it UO. I mean,
exactly. Like even the bugs, even the things that weren't intended, people just love that stuff.
Yeah, we had a conscious policy of when something wacky happens, run with it rather than fix it. My favorite example, I told it to some of you during the prep, was the Siege of Trinsic. Originally, carpenters could build wooden furniture and they could drop it anywhere. Like you could drop anything anywhere. One of the first things that happened actually in the game was players spelling out the F word on the bridge out of Britain. right? Using fish. That was one of the first things that happened in the game. And we're sitting there
That
staring
still
at it going,
happens.
what do we do, right? We don't know. Do we pick up the fish? No, we should make fish rot really quickly. They do in real life, and that way it won't stick around, right? That was our approach to things. Early on, we tried to fix things in the fiction. So these guys, you know, Trinsic has the gate on the west that's the big one, and there's a much smaller gate near the water towards the south. And originally that gate was called Traitor's Gate, and it was 1 tile wide. And it was a favorite player killing haunt because when you came out, you couldn't necessarily see what was going on behind the wall. So an army of rogue player killing carpenters blockaded the main gate and filled an entire screen's worth of desks and armoires and chairs stacked one on top of the other. And this meant that people who appeared in Trinsic couldn't get out the main gate, which was nice and wide and you could see. They all had to go out Traitor's Gate, and then the player killers would nail them, right? Because they could only come out one at a time, and there was player-to-player collision back then. So you came out, you got wedged in the gate, and they just squished you, right? Almost immediately. So because of this, we added shoving through people that was strength-based, right? Something that later games punted on, said you can just never collide with other people, thereby destroying all kinds of player-to-player tactics, right? Combat tactics. And then the siege went on for over a week, right? Where people kept appearing in Trinsic and they couldn't get out. All those people were trapped for a week. So we quietly just mentioned in the next patch note, axes now have the ability to chop up furniture. And when everybody saw that patch note, the servers came up, everybody logged into Trinsic, chopped their way out and exterminated all the carpenters immediately. And that was awesome. That was the original siege of Trinsic. Later on, there was a GM run event that used the same name, but that was the original one. And it kind of summed up what our original philosophy was. You know, preserve the freedoms, find ways to make the fixes be in players' hands and not in the hands of the game operators. That was our philosophy.
It's kind of like what we're doing right here with this, like this area that you're in with the jousting. It's something new. It's just a spring festival, but it's completely player-driven. Everything. Like we have player roleplay theater coming up this week. We have players that learned how to. We have a piano in the game with the notes, and so they're making boats with, making books with the notes in them. So then they can, just kind of put on a show for people. And we have, real life auctions. Remember those back in the day? Remember player ran auctions? Yeah, we have those. We kind of, it's all just player driven. This jousting thing you're seeing in game, completely player ran here. They've been doing it for quite a while. But yeah, and I completely agree with you. Having everything player ran, player driven is like, it's the best. You want to keep out of it as much as we can as staff. So.
Well, and I think like it goes with custom housing as well, where people can design their own house, and you basically, you know, it's player-driven content. There's going to be ugly houses, there's going to be nice houses, and I mean that's just how it's going to be.
I just thought of another answer for one of the favorite feature or whatever that question was.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hues.
So how is that, like, I mean, without getting too, I guess, nerdy, like how is that like done? Hues.
Yeah. So back then we there was 16-bit color. We couldn't do alpha transparency. The standard high-end graphics format was something called a Targa that nobody uses anymore. There were no PNGs. The only things with transparency were GIFs. I'll say it that way. Avoid the controversies. And right, or BMPs, which are way, way, way too heavy to send around, right? They weren't compressed. So we had come from text mods. In text mods, you could look like any goddamn thing you wanted, right? And in fact, on Legend Mod, you could even earn something called string coupons, which allowed you to ask an admin to rewrite your appearance or the appearance of your items. So you could get a sword and get its name changed to a razor sharp wit. And from then on, people saw you, so-and-so punctures your lung with a razor sharp wit, right? You get the idea. When we started on UO, we're like, oh, but we need total character customization. And at the time, things like the Realm offered some character customization, and that was about it, right? Like you couldn't customize your character in standalone RPGs of the time. Okay, that was just not a thing yet. And we said, no, we got to be able to do it like as far as is possible. We ended up putting the alpha channel in. We used the 16-bit color and stole 1 bit, which is why if you click the options tab and go to your video options in your client right now, you will see this use 565 mode or whatever. What that means is use the mode where some of those bits are stolen for alpha. In order to do the color tinting, we stole a method that was used really commonly in older pixel art graphics, which was palletized graphics, right? These days, when you look at pixel art, people don't stick to a limited palette of colors. But earlier games, you were capped. You had no more than 16 colors, no more than 256 colors, right? And one of the things that artists could do was that they could make a piece of art out of 256 color slots and then use a palette and swap it, right? And that's how many of the older games did things like animate their water, is that they would say, well, slot 3, I painted it with blue, but swap the palette periodically and slot 3 will become white, okay? That's how a lot of those effects were done. And if you look for Google color cycling pixel art, you'll see tons of examples. So we took that idea of a palette and we said, and I co-designed this system with Rick. We said, if a piece of art is true gray, okay, meaning that it's the R value and the G value and the B value in the RGB color are all exactly the same. So it is true grayscale. That means it is tintable. When you draw that, see if it has what we called a hue attached. And it would look into a color strip of pixels and selectively replace the gray pixels with the colors out of that color strip. And each of those palettes was called a hue. And that is, to this day, how all of the color shit on screen right now is happening. You know, the weird blue person with the antlers over there, and the color of the ethereal that I am riding, and the green capes, and even the true black dye, okay? It's all done that way. Pixel replacing. Today, we would call that a pixel shader. But we had to process the pixels in code, right, on the fly back then. And then we had a truly shitty tool for designing hues. Like for making the palettes and saving them, it was awful. Luckily, one of the many players who was hacking the client wrote their own hue viewer that was awesome. And they were using it in order to put hues in the game that didn't exist. So we took their hue viewer and made it our hue tool. We just said, awesome, we like this tool. We're not going to ban you. It's fantastic. And we just put it in as part of our content pipelines. When we did ice things, all that was making a hue that instead of going from the darkest to the lightest, it went from the lightest to the darkest. And that is why the ice-looking things look like photo negatives.
Oh,
that's how we did that hue.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Hues are actually underutilized.
So those really like super neon hues, that's how that happened?
That's
Like
how
those
that
really-
happened.
Oh,
The
you know
thing
what?
is,
People go
because that's-
nuts over that stuff right now too.
Okay, because that's a palette,
Glacial
people
hue,
actually
yeah.
underutilize what hues could do. You could make an object or clothing that has things like stripes or patterns in particular shades of gray. And if you designed your hue palette correctly, you could make it so that the logo appears or disappears, right? By designing your palettes correctly. You'd actually be able to do things like animated color cycling palettes on clothing. We just never made hues that did that very much. And the artists instead, they hated hues, because it meant that all of their art direction was being destroyed, right? You got horrendous looking things like this orange person here with the feathered cap or whatever that is in the torch, right? The artist would look at that in utter horror, going, oh my God, that's terrible, right? So they made a set of hues. Here are the metallic ones. Here's the cloth colors. Here's the, wood colors. Don't use any others. And us designers just started making our own as soon as that tool was.
I think that's funny because, some of the really old school players, like from Second Age, stuff like that, they just hate that stuff too. Like, they hate it. And the new players, they're like, oh, I want it. They go nuts over it. But the old players are like, oh, it's blinding,
The pure white here is somebody who just you make a solid palette of white, right? But the hue table, there were less hues than there were entries in the table. And especially the very first hue index was invalid, right? It was supposed to be the you don't have a hue index. And somebody managed to packet inject that hue into a dye tub. And the result was a hue where every single color in the palette was 000 black. And the art directors had very carefully made it so that nothing in the game was 0 black, so that we could use it for outlines, we could use it for shadows, and all the rest. And that became the first pure black dye tub. And because you could copy colors from dye tub to dye tub, pure black clothing spread everywhere. And the artists were horrified because they said, it looks like it's a hole in the world. It was Vanta Black, right? Vanta Black, have you seen that crazy paint that absorbs all light, right? Vanta Black, until Vanta Black existed, there's no such thing as complete black with no light, right? So the artists were horrified. They're like, there should be highlights. There should be reflectivity. What's going on, And we went back and forth, and we ended up saying, it's too big, it's too popular, let's let players run with it. So that color was added to the game by players, not by us, and we just let them have it.
It's a happy accident in the end, though.
No, it was a hack. It wasn't an accident.
Well, happy,
It was a
happy
happy
hack,
story.
I guess. To this day, it's one of the best.
I actually like things like the way the bear here has a little bit of white to it, right? It's got some gray. He's got some shape. He doesn't just look like a hole.
Yeah.
Right?
What do you feel about people's, what are your, I guess, how do you feel about people selling stuff on eBay? One of our own admins, Epi here, said he sold a tower on Atlantic for $800. So what are your thoughts on that?
Epi either came to it late or got ripped off. Towers used to sell for over $1,000. So I don't know what happened to you, man. The original take was, well, this is showing that players are passionate about the game. And if players are passionate about something, who are we to tell them that they are doing it wrong? And so instead, we monitored the eBay exchange rate to the US dollar, and I maintained Excel graphs of it. And that is how we would spot dupe bugs. Because we could watch the exchange rate and knew if the exchange rate moved, that we had developed some means of counterfeiting gold.
Richard actually told us that, and he also told us that that's how you guys kind of valued your game as well, like what your gold was worth. You know what I mean? Like in
Yeah.
the world. Yeah.
It was until when we finally stomped the server crashing dupe bugs and the, you know, crossing server line dupe bugs. When we finally managed to stomp some of those, sometime in the T2A period, the exchange rate between the dollar and UO gold stabilized at 400 GP to the dollar and stayed put for a year and a half before new dupe bugs were eventually introduced and the game economy tanked. And in particular, it really tanked when the Trammel split happened, because it meant that all of your stuff was disappearing because player killers would take it and then it would get destroyed. And that removed a massive economic drain from the game. But it was stable at 400 GP to the dollar for a very long time. And during that entire period, that meant that UO was a stabler currency than the Italian lira and had a better exchange rate.
That's insane. So that's all for community
Yeah.
questions.
We can.
Oh, a ton went by in Twitch, man.
Oh yeah,
I-
we can. If you want to find
let's go
some,
through-
I'm sure
yeah,
there's
let's
lots.
go
But
through
we were
them.
gonna get you to do some of this jousting. Well, they said they still got like another 40 minutes of jousts left, I think here. we were-
You know,
you
between
wanna
you
do
and
that,
me,
or-
I'm happy to preside over the jousting
Yeah.
and just answer
Okay,
questions.
sure, no problem.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, we were gonna get you involved, but yeah, you don't have to do that. If you want to just keep asking questions, you know, so like one of my questions was too, like remember I told you before, it was actually in our prep meeting here or whatever, with Richard Garriott, I asked him, you know, yeah, if you know how UO was built or whatever, if you know you remove one piece of the puzzle on, you know, a certain thing, 10 other things would fail. Now was that a happy accident, you know what I mean, or was that like a
No,
because that's genius in my opinion, like that's insane.
that was
Like,
not an accident.
and I've
that
always
was very,
had
very
that.
careful, conscious, intentional design. I mentioned earlier that my wife Kristen and I did a bunch of the design and submitted it as our job application, right? I still have notebooks, which I am now going to show you, and most people have never seen any of this stuff, where we worked out, like, there is the inheritance tree for NPCs in UO. Here is the list of features we needed to do, and at the bottom, you can see where we're making lists of all of the professions and all of the roles that people should be able to take on. We submitted the idea as part of our job application that objects should be made of abstract qualities, like things should be made of metal, things should be made of wood, things, grass should grow, sheep should grow wool and be made of meat, all of that stuff. And at the time that we submitted that, that was not a thing. Later on, games like The Sims and Thief and Minecraft use that same approach of abstract properties behind the scenes. And we were pitching the idea that we should make an online virtual world where everything in the game was built on these abstract properties behind the scenes. And then stack all of the AI and all of the crafting and all the rest on that, okay? And Chris and I designed that on a road trip to Austin one summer. And that's what we, you know, we still have the note pages where we worked that out. They're actually on my blog, and you can go find them there on a blog post called UO is 15. So that means I posted those pictures up like 5+ years ago now. That system with the AI, this is the famous dragon example, right? Where players would kill all the deer and the dragons wouldn't have anything to eat, so they'd keep looking, and therefore they would attack the players who live in the town, which creates a quest for you to go and kill the dragon, right? That was the pitch. That's what we pitched Richard and Star on. And that's why we got the job. That did not ship. We had it in the alpha. We had it in the early beta. It didn't scale. This is where the closed economy came from as well. And so the AI got turned off. But the crafting system still worked that way. When you killed a sheep or a cow, either way, what happened was it copied a certain number of units of meat from the living animal to the corpse. And anything that was made of meat, you could use a knife on anything made of meat, and you could carve it and get fillets. And anything that represented meat could therefore be cooked. And anything that represented cooked meat could therefore be an ingredient in a pie or in a steak, or you get the idea. So we didn't handcraft any of the crafting recipes in UO. They are not handcrafted one-shot recipes, any of them. They're all based on abstract properties. This is also why you got 8x8 macroing. We couldn't afford to store the amount of grass for every tile. So we put an invisible object down every 8x8 tile chunks and summed up the grass and the wood and the ore and everything else that was built into the map into that one invisible object, which was called a chunk egg. And when you chopped wood, what happened was it queried the chunk egg in your chunk and said, how many units of wood are left on it? Transfer them to your backpack where they become logs. Everything in the game worked that way. Okay? Early on, orcs could smell the gold you carried in your backpack and would go after it and loot it because they just smelled gold. Early on, there were plans for if people died, the chunk egg would gain a small amount of death. And that would be where necromantic magic would come from. You could only cast spells near death. So that would lead to players engaging in human sacrifice to build up death in a place so that then they could cast spells. This meant that a dragon early on could breathe fire and the forest could catch fire because fire knew that it ate wood. Okay? That is what underlay UO. Still underlies UO. It was called the resource system. And there's a giant 3-part article on my blog. Just Google UO resource system and it'll explain everything. If you pull out to this day the original UO strategy guide, I have it on my shelf.
The emulator still actually works that way in chunks.
Yeah.
Yes. If you open the official strategy guide to UO, you will find in it the actual stats for how much meat, how much fruit each creature represents. All of that shit is still in there, except for the AI. Right? That was the beating heart of UO. That was at its very, very core.
That's honestly, it's just genius, man. It's just, it's like you got to pick your jaw up off the floor as you're hearing all this, you know, trying to click it. It's just, it's amazing, man. Honestly, like, I always wondered if it was, you know, how, I don't know, like, because a lot of people can't even like the amount of time it would take and the amount, like, I don't know, like, how long did it take you?
Yeah, it wasn't that big, and the AI wasn't even that complicated. You know, it was easy to do things like the reason why something wanted to attack you is because you were carrying something it wanted or because you were food. And it wouldn't attack you if it wasn't hungry. So you could actually do things like, oh, crap, here's a dragon. What do we do? And you say, it's okay, I'll feed my horse to it. Then it won't be hungry anymore. And I can walk past it. Right? That's the kind of thing that that AI was intended for. We did, we took that same concept later and added the idea that what if each of those individual resources had stats? And that is how Star Wars Galaxies crafting worked. It used the same idea. So if any of the folks out there played Star Wars Galaxies, that's why crafting in Galaxies was so awesome.
I didn't know that either. Yeah. Huh.
Yeah, talk about the Germany thing, by the way, with the cutting up corpses.
Right. So corpses, humans were made out of meat. So originally that meant you could take the knife, cut up a human corpse, and you'd get meat. And because it was just automatic, if you cut up a cow, you got a fillet of cow. Cut up a duck, you got a fillet of duck. Cut up, I don't know, cut up, who's fighting right now? Who's dueling? Who just won? Khaleesi? Cut up Khaleesi, you got a fillet of Khaleesi. Make a meat pie with that fillet, and you got a meat pie of Khaleesi.
Yeah,
Right?
So there's like with that whole aspect of the crafting, you know, like you said, the fillets and all that. So many other games are using that exact idea, right? There's Conan Exiles is a big one right now, where you know anything and everything is a resource, and it can be used to do something. Like I just love that whole concept.
But something
Well,
happened
the
in
thing is-
Germany because of this, the human flesh.
Yeah, that meant that we supported cannibalism. And, you know, hey, players can be cannibals. Well, Germany has still to this day very tight restrictions. When we launched in Europe, we had to change all of the blood in the game to green. Germany does not allow blood in the games. That's still kind of the case. That's why you end up fighting zombies and whatnot in a lot of FPSs. So we had to take out cannibalism and take out carving people up. But you could, there was a designer, he was slightly sick and twisted. He made it so you could dismember and dismantle a corpse all the way down to like thigh bones and femurs, right? Because we had all of those wonderful bone bits that were intended for the dungeons. So he just asked one day, can I take the script and just keep adding more and more ways to cut up people? And he made it so you could cut them up to a ridiculous degree. So that's where all of that ended up coming from.
Maybe you could
I
show
have-
us. Maybe you could show us your. What do you have? What do you got now?
I have tons of cool artifacts here that I wonder if people want to see.
Absolutely. Yes,
Yeah,
please.
Absolutely.
So I showed you some of the things in this notebook. I was credited in UO for doing art and design and programming. We talked about that a little bit. A lot of the art that I did, some of it isn't visible here. Those of you who are right on the northern edge and the western edge of this room, you can see the embankments along the side of the water. I was the one who did the technical design for embankments and 3D terrain along with Rick, figuring out the ways that we could do 3D terrain. To this day, if you play in an area of the game on the original map that used 3D, like has hills and whatnot, odds are pretty good that I built it. Here you can see me doing the technical design for the, let me see here. This is tricky. I'm juggling so many windows. This is me working out how aspects of walls and the buttresses and whatnot would work. And I wanted these for trinsic. So I worked that out so that we would have those intrinsic someday. You might also recognize where I specified what I wanted Magencia to look like. And this got handed over to artists. I said, I want things that look like this. You can see we were doing this kind of technical design. We're working it out bit by bit and tile by tile because everything was actually placed tile by tile. UO's original map is a bit over 4K by 4K. We had a lot of challenges with things where it was hard to make them look good in our weird angle. So I did a lot of sketching out things, and I believe we might be able to find this exact lamppost and this exact candelabra still around in the game. I think they're all over the place. You probably know the Mage Tower in Britain. Our wall set originally consisted of the post, the left wall, the right wall, and the V, which went in the front. And I was like, all of our buildings are going to look like boxes. That's not good enough. And so I demanded that we do these. I went and I hacked the art that was already there and came up with ways for arches to work. And then I made the artists make nice art on top of my crappy templates. So, and that is why you have arches. There's some in the bottom right corner, right down there. Yeah, you can blame me for those. When you walk past 3D terrain that is that impassable stuff, right? The dirt in between the grass that is impassable. This is me working out the way to do that and what tile set we would need to make a complete set so that we could have terraced terrain. You can see these are the actual names of the files and the names as they would appear in the editor, right up here.
What about animations in terms of the art? Like how much of a pain in the ass was that?
Huge. If you were doing a 2D animation, you had to hand draw all of the frames. For the characters, we had a group of 3D artists who would create the character in high resolution 3D, not so high for today, but it was high res back then. And then they had to set up this incredibly slow automated process of putting them on a turntable. And they ran a script, and the script rotated the camera, snapped a screenshot, rotated the camera, snapped a screenshot. And they had to do this for every possible combination of every possible piece of clothing that could overlap, so that the clothing sprites would be cut away in the right places so you wouldn't get things that shouldn't draw on top of others showing up. And then it's drawn by stacking them. You just draw a stack of these, right? But that meant that they were all 3D renders, and somebody had to go through and cut them all out from the background. So the amount of frames it took to make one animating creature was absolutely bananas. And those of you who've gone into trying to make new art for the game know that.
Yeah, like for the clothing especially, you have to do every single fighting stance in every direction and every rotation.
That's why there's so few animations for characters. Here you can see me sketching plants. You can actually see a list of plants. I did quite a lot of the flowers, the jungly plants, things like that. Let me see. I mentioned, I'm looking here on the screen, I mentioned the tree and the flowers. If you ever see a foxglove, if you ever see anything that looks like a palm tree, those potted rosemary that's on the dais there behind you guys, those were me. I did an enormous amount of the various plants and flowers in the game. And I sketched most of them out of one issue of National Geographic that we had for a reference. So most of them came from that. I also did a whole bunch of sketching. Like, I assume you guys all know, many of you maybe still have it framed, I hope, right? We can hope that you still have this guy, right? You all still have this?
Yeah, Epi does. It's on the screen.
Well, the thing is, you've seen that, but you don't know that the original intent was for it to be this. We were going to have all 4 continents from the original Ultima games. The lands of the feudal lords and all of that stuff. We were going to do all of that. Serpent Isle, right there. was supposed to be in the original UO, and we didn't have time to build it. We even worked up fiction and storylines for the history of what had happened there. By the way, you might notice Serpent Isle is upside down. That's because it's south of the equator.
So when you say you didn't have enough time, like what do you mean by that? Like
What I mean is this. Rick started working with the Ultima 6 engine at the beginning of 1995. Okay? He started working with it in like January, February of 1995. Chris and I came out and interviewed over our spring break in 1995. We started working on the team September 1st, 1995. Right? That was the same, like a week from when all the other original people other than Rick started. And the game launched in September of 1997. Everything you just heard was done in 2 years. Worse than that, okay, is that we made the alpha and it supported 250. So we threw away the code base and started over in 1996. Almost from scratch in order to have multi-server. We threw away the original scripting language, did a new one. Threw away the original conversation system, did a new one. So what you know as UO was built in a year by a team of crazy people.
Yeah,
that is why we didn't have time.
I totally believe that. Go ahead.
Even the map you think you know this map, right? But you're wrong. Those islands were sunk under the sea because we couldn't finish. The art for this unique culture is what became the art in Second Age. These were folks who lived in reed houses put on stilts. And you saw those in Second Age. This city called Taratha, some of you might remember an issue of Computer Games magazine that showed a volcano and sea serpents. Taratha was where that volcano was. I worked on Taratha for a month and we ran out of time and I had to sink it under the sea. And that is where the spider webs and the spider creatures came from. And the heavy dark brown brick stone architecture that is used elsewhere in the game. And that is why instead, when the time came to give Dennis Loubet source art for him to make the cloth map, I drew this, and Dennis based the cloth map that you have on this specific piece of paper. He took it and he traced it and he made the cloth map.
Yeah, that's unreal. Yeah, nobody has that. That's for sure. You're the only person.
Yeah, that's the only one there is.
Yeah, that's their original.
How many cloth maps do you own?
Several. Like not just UO, but I have cloth maps for a bunch of the older Ultimas and all the rest.
Whose idea was that for the cloth maps, sending it with the game?
Richard did cloth maps starting like one of the very first Ultimas. Random, I see Mrs. Listed just asked, swimming. Yes, swimming was supposed to be there. That is why we had sea serpents and dolphins and all the rest. And in fact, to this day, those of you who've messed around with the maps, you might notice that much of the ocean is flat terrain painted with terrain tiles that are water. But close to the coast, there is a trench dug all the way around. And instead, the water is objects. That is because players were supposed to be able to go under that water. And it is because fish and sea serpents were supposed to swim under that water. And we had to cut that entire feature. But that is why their trenches dug. Shallow versus deep water was supposed to be a feature of UO.
And I imagine that's why mobiles have
layouts by literally drawing them tile by tile. This is Serpent's Hold. So this is how I would actually plan out cities. We would sit there and do early sketches to plan, can you actually do this with the tile set that we have?
That's badass. You're the real OG right there. That's incredible.
So some of our early players, of course, I don't know, are there any, there might be some folks out there who remember the early days of role-playing on UO. There was a famous tavern named Cazola's Tavern. There was a player, I think he might have just finished college or was still finishing college. So there was a famous player at the time who hung out with the Cazola's Tavern role players, and he kept making these comic strips. And, you know, there's a UO troll and a UO ogre in there. You should be able to recognize that ogre. That ogre art is still in the game, right? And I loved this. So I featured these on the website. Well, eventually that guy started a comic strip that wasn't about UO. He started his own comic strip called PvP Online. Him and the Penny Arcade guys were the first webcomics artists way back when. It was them and what's that? The one I can't remember the name. Add the little black fuzzball. So here, an early example of that comic. I used to be a character in it. Of course, he would show up at player luncheons, and I'd hang out with him and his wife. He did a custom comic strip for me. That unfortunately the reflection of the game is messing up, but I'll zoom in here so you can see what he wrote in the dedication to me. They want houses to be safe. Of course they do. Bug number however many. Skull the Troll is still a character in the comic strip PvP Online, which was eventually picked up by Image Comics and today has won the Harvey and the Eisner Awards for best comic strip in the world a couple of times.
Really? Huh.
Yes, he is actually
I remember that
the
comic.
top comic strip artists in the world today. A multiple Harvey and Eisner Award winner.
I remember like reading that comic years ago too, and yeah, that's crazy. I had no
Well,
idea.
the one of his you might know today if you play D&D is Table Titans, which is the official licensed D&D comic strip. That's still that guy, Scott Kurtz.
I had no idea. That's crazy.
Yep.
A cool question that just came in.
The stories run deep. This is the first time for me in probably 15 years that I have logged into a UO shard. But I can go anytime. Because I actually still have a rune to the First Bank of Britain. And this is, I think, the only rune to the First Bank of Britain that is out there.
That's amazing.
We were looking to make UO merchandise, and that was one of the things that we considered. So there's a whole bunch of random UO merch that only, you know, a small handful of samples were ever made, and that's one of them. So I have one of the tiny samples of a UO rune, a real UO rune. While I was at GDC, we did the UO Classic 20th year anniversary classic game postmortem. And I wore the original team t-shirt, which predates the UO logo. So there is a different UO logo out there. And I wore that t-shirt for the postmortem. But Rich Vogel was there, and he said, well, I was cleaning out my garage. He had brought with him the UO team hoodie that I was supposed to get and never got.
Oh, that is amazing.
So I have a brand new 20-year-old UO team hoodie here that had never seen the light of day, was still sitting in its package.
It looks brand new.
It is brand new, man. Yeah. It's never used. It's been worn once now.
There's a really cool question that came in. Is there any secrets the devs put into the UO that went undiscovered?
Oh, that's a good question. There was tons of stuff that was put in and then never quite got finished, like stuff in City of Wind, puzzles in the dungeons, the entire thing with the Mage Tower and the maze. Tons of stuff like that was put in and never quite finished. There are references in the books. The books are filled with little Easter eggs that people probably still don't even realize. Like there's one that's a poem, I think, that actually has in it the names of every meeting room in the Origin building. And that's in there. So yeah, there's a bunch of random little references like that. There are things that people have forgotten, like all of the lore got very inconsistent over time. Yes, it was the covetous dungeon puzzle things with the number codes and shit like that. There was stuff like that. I want to say some of it was done by Todd Mckinney, and Todd left the team. Yeah, a lot of stuff that he did ended up being left incomplete. Todd today runs Legend Mud, funny enough. Yeah, there's stuff like that. I think players have found most of it. I mean, you found cow tipping, you found the llamas, you found the J. Wilson slime. The J. Wilson slime was because Johnny Wilson of PC Gamer, I think, he was editor-in-chief. He named UO
It was a troll.
Coaster of the Year. So it won the award for worst game of the year. It also that year won RPG of the year and PC game of the year and all of that. But it also won Coaster of the Year. And Star was so pissed off that he had us create a slime. And of course, slimes back then, every time you killed it, every time you hit it, it had a chance of splitting in two. So that's where the J. Wilson slime came from. It was a slam at that editor. I had a good chat with Johnny because we got to know each other, and I was like, "You got to admit, the game turned out to be super important." He's like, "I never said it wasn't a great achievement. It was just broken as hell, and you know it." So we agreed to disagree. PC Gamer at the time was Gary Whitta. That's hilarious. You guys now know Gary Whitta as the guy who wrote Rogue One, the movie.
Oh.
So there's a random bit of trivia for you. Gary switched to screenwriting and wrote Book of Eli, Rogue One, and that one with Will Smith and Jaden Smith where they're lost on a planet. I don't even remember. Anyway, yep, Gary's still a friend. Yeah, but I can't remember if there are any other like serious like Easter eggs like that are still left. I think you guys probably found most all of them. One of the problems with turnover, UO shipped September and near the end of September of 1997. The programmers suddenly had to have pagers. I mean, they had to have this during the beta. They had to carry pagers because smartphones weren't a thing. And they had to be on call 24/7. It was exhausting. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to make a post-apocalyptic or cyberpunky world, I think it was. Instead of making UO2, they got told no. Anyway, for a variety of reasons, the entire programming team quit by January. The design team, most of them went to U9 or over to UO2. I was frozen out of UO2 and left as lead designer on UO. Damien went over to UO2. Damien and I actually collaborated on a pitch for a sci-fi MMO as our sequel to UO and never got to pitch it because we were told, nope, it's going to be UO2. That came from on high from EA. So he went off to do UO2, and that meant that within 3 months of UO launching, I was the only original UO team member left on the game. And we had to hire out of the game player community This is where Faceless and Runesaber and those guys all came from. They were players that we hired because they were programmers and had come to the player luncheons and we had gotten to know them. And I was asked to build Second Age in 2 months. We were handed a few programmers from probably a canceled Jane's Flight Simulator game. Remember, Origin was making things like AH-64 Longbow and other sims like that. So I was handed a couple of people. One of them was actually Damien's younger brother, who's also gone on to a long time game dev career. And we built all of Second Age. We had to hire the programmers who had quit as contractors at an exorbitant amount of pay. And we built all of Second Age in 2 months. And then EA said, wait, can you add real-time translation of languages and a few other things? So they gave us an extra month, and we integrated the technology behind Babelfish into UO and made it a real-time chat translation feature. And so that is how T2A shipped with a total dev time of 3 months with no slippage during UO Live. I see the question, are any of those UO devs still in the industry? Absolutely. Tons of them are. I mentioned Dan Rubenfield, the designer who liked cannibalism. He went on to work at DICE. He went on to work on PlayStation Home. So he worked on some of the early Battlefield games, I believe. Rick Delaschmidt went on to do, he worked on Star Wars Galaxies. He worked on a bunch of the early MMOs as a contractor and consultant. 10-6, if you remember that, and bunches of others. And today he works with a bunch of the Star Wars Galaxies guys, and they do games like Pocket Legends. So he has continued to be one of the pioneers of MMOs, and one of the first programmers to ever move MMOs fully onto mobile. Jason Spangler, still active. Damien Schubert, of course. SWOTOR, Shadowbane, bunches of others. Today he worked on what was it called? He worked in mobile games for a while, and now he's got a studio that I forget the name of. Yeah, many of the UO folks. And in fact, many of the QA team has gone on to do that. Today, when you play Elder Scrolls Online under the design leadership of somebody like Paul Sage, you're playing a game designed by a former game master on UO. So yeah, the influence of UO across the industry was enormous.
How about yourself? What are you up to these days?
I went on, I made, after UO, I pitched several games. One of them turned into Privateer Online and didn't make it to launch. It was killed in favor of Earth and Beyond. When that happened, our entire team quit, and we put ourselves on the market as a team. And that team was hired as a group, and we ended up being the core team that made Star Wars Galaxies. So I was creative director for that game. If you see things that are common between UO and Galaxies, that's why. After Galaxies, before it was even finished, I was promoted to Chief Creative Officer at Sony Online. That meant I basically did like editorial review on pretty much everything that SOE published for a while, which included things like EverQuest 2, PlanetSide, EverQuest Online Adventures, Untold Legends. I actually rewrote just about every scrap of text in Untold Legends for the PSP. After that, I quit and did a startup called MetaPlace. MetaPlace was the back end to the Matrix, Ready Player One, Snow Crash. It was a tool suite that allowed anybody to run and host something a lot like a UO Gray Shard on a web page running in Flash. And it had complete scripting, art import, and you could build any kind of game you wanted, from an MMORPG to Tetris or a puzzle game or, you know, space combat. We launched that at peak between 2008 to late 2009. We had upwards of 50,000 worlds built by users running on that network. We pivoted and made Facebook games with that technology, had a couple of hits, Island Life, My Vineyard, and then were acquired by Disney. And that technology went on to be the back end for Club Penguin. If you ever played that on iOS, that was running against the engine that I designed for that.
Wow. That's insane.
So no remnants of that tech remain today because Club Penguin Mobile has been shut down. Right around the time that happened, I was at Disney for 3 years and a bit. And the Game Developers Conference handed me this for my contributions to online gaming. So basically, it's a very heavy brick that is a Lifetime Achievement Award. And they gave me that and told me about it. I had not quite turned 40. And it kind of discombobulated me. Only a few weeks later, I left Disney, right alongside a bunch of other people like Warren Spector, after having done, minor work, touching a variety of things like Disney Infinity, Fantasia, Deep Realms, City Girl, Full Bloom. Those are all Facebook games you never heard of. And I started doing consulting and whatnot. And my first big project as a consultant, if any of you go to Buffalo Wild Wings and you've played trivia on the tablets of Buffalo Wild Wings, you played my game. I made jackpot trivia that you play in sports bars. So ironically, that and my Facebook games are probably the most popular games that I've ever made. Far more popular than UO. I had clients like Facebook, Google, Unity, Activision, a bunch of other, big companies like that. And I also, along the way, I wrote a book. I did a couple. I'm best known for this one. It's called A Theory of Fun for Game Design, and it is one of the most popular books about game design out there. It's been in print continuously now for almost 15 years. A few years ago, I did this one, a book of poetry, actually. So that came out just a couple of years ago. And I literally, day before yesterday, wrote the very final words in a manuscript called Postmortems, Selected Essays, Volume 1. And that one is all of the stories I just told you. It's a collection of the stories and the design articles about how UO was made, how Legend Mud was made, how Galaxies was made, how Metaplace was made. It's all the post-mortem material for that. And I just finished writing it, and it should be coming out within a month. So if you're interested in that at all and want to read more behind-the-scenes stuff, you can follow me on Twitter, check out my blog, and that stuff will be there. And that's enough self-promo. I see somebody complaining already.
Absolutely not.
Too bad.
No, yeah, that's too bad.
Can you like elaborate on UO2 a little bit, like why it didn't launch? Basically, the story behind that.
Yeah, so it's sort of a complicated story. UO2 probably should never have been greenlit in the sense that EA didn't understand that the game was not going to die in less than 6 months, right? But they didn't understand what games as a service were. They didn't understand what an online game meant. They literally thought UO would come out, sell 50,000, less than 50,000 copies, and then would lose all of its players over the space of less than a year, and nobody would play it anymore, and it would get shut down. Therefore, they greenlit a UO2 literally within a couple of months of UO coming out. They're like, we got to do a new one, right? And so they took a whole group. It consisted of most of the U9 people who preferred UO to 9. And they hired a whole bunch of people from other early MMO projects. Games that nobody remembers today. Rubies of Eventide and Illusia and games like that. And they built up a fairly sizable team. And that team started working on trying to make a UO in 3D and had none of the original UO team on the team. They did have a bunch of people who'd made online games, but not any of the UO team. And my good friend Damien was the lead designer on it. But Damien had come on during the very tail end of UO. So he'd been on live for like a month, right? He'd made Meridian 59 before that. Totally knew what he was doing. Damien was the first guy I met on a MUD. He was actually a MUD admin on the first MUD I started playing, and I met him on the first day I started. So we've known each other a very, very long time. I actually got him his job on Meridian 59. The result was a team that was already too large, that over-engineered the project, in my opinion, didn't have enough of the UO team expertise on it, so we're reinventing a lot of wheels. And it was the first time UO had done that, and U9 were happening at the same time. And it was the first time really that Origin had done full 3D, anything to that degree. Those of you who've tried to play Ultima 9 know that it barely runs even today. There are things in Ultima 9 like spoons on tables that have texture maps that are 4K by 4K, right? There were just things in there that were just not reasonable from a performance point of view. That's part of why it still doesn't run well. And so, you know, the company just didn't have enough of the knowledge going on that team. So they worked hard and they made a bunch of really cool stuff. I don't want to put UO2 down because it was a badass team full of badass people. But from the get-go, right, it had all of these strange compromises in the midst. One of the other things that happened from fairly early on was what to me were some odd fiction choices. Odd fiction choices that showed up also in UO eventually. That would be the weird period where we started getting, I think I have it up here. I don't know if I can reach it. Weird stuff by Todd McFarlane, right? I can't reach it. It's too high up on the shelf. You know, that really just like didn't fit like the original UO look, right?
Your webcam went out there.
We lost your cam.
I think you unplugged something, maybe.
Yeah. I think it might be coming back. Maybe.
Not yet. Did
Not
you
yet.
unplug it? We lost them.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. It's just, there's just no, it's not the same without seeing your face.
Was I that fascinated?
Check in Zoom. There might be a like disable.
What would
or
he
something.
have possibly done? He just stood up and sat there. Did you?
I stood up and bumped the monitor that is the hub for my webcam. Pretty sure that's what I just did. So.
Well, Raph, you're super
No,
computer savvy. I'm sure you could get there.
Hey,
It is.
there you go.
Yeah, back.
Rejoice.
So yeah, there was a bunch of stuff like that that what just was challenges for them from the very beginning, and gradually over time, UO kept doing well, and there was the question of, well, wait, how much sense does it make to do this? We should be doing something that doesn't cannibalize UO, right? And that tension just kept happening back and forth, right? EA didn't know what to do with online games. They just didn't know what to do. At that point, we were pitching Privateer Online, and they canceled that in favor of Earth and Beyond, which was an MMO by Westwood. And then they went on to attempt to get savvy about online games. by acquiring expert online game companies. They acquired 2 that were really significant. One of them was a casual portal called Pogo, and the other was a classic online game company called Kesmai. These guys were one of the absolute pioneers of online games in the 80s. They made a multiplayer Battletech, Air Warrior, Legends of Kesmai, classic game company. We had actually hired their general manager away, and you know him as OSI tyrant, Gordon Walton. So we hired their general manager away. EA bought both those companies and tried building something called EA.com and lost $500 million back when that meant something, right? They lost that in the, early, the very late 90s, right? So it was a massive disaster. And Sims Online was another piece of that disaster that came out of that. So EA effectively left online gaming at that point. By the way, people always mistakenly think, oh, EA took over UO and ruined it. EA greenlit UO.
Yeah.
Origin was owned by EA well before Ultima Online.
Yeah, actually, Richard.
People forget
Star,
that. They always
Richard
want to blame EA. That's not accurate.
Yeah.
However, EA hated Origin because Origin always ran over and wasn't very businesslike. Right? So there was just constant conflict there. And eventually, when Privateer Online was canceled, I was also on tour doing a press tour because Richard had to drop out of doing a press tour to Taiwan and Australia. I had to fly there on short notice. I was like, I'm not even on UO anymore. I'm on Privateer. Why are you making me go? Richard can't go. It has to be you. Okay, so I went there and attended a player lunch in Australia, got treated like Lord British, which was awesome. I got limoed around and everything. That was great. But that meant that I got a call at 2 o'clock in the morning, Australia time. I was staying at the same hotel where Michael Hutchence of InXS hung himself. And I get a call at 2 o'clock in the morning saying, well, we got to let you know, before the luncheon starts and, the breakfast starts at, in 5 hours or 6 hours, Privateer Online has been canceled and Lord British is gone. The heart of Origin has been fired. He is no longer at EA. When I got back, I ran into Richard in the hallway. I jokingly said to him, so I guess you're going to start something new. What are you going to call it? Destination instead? It turned out I guessed correctly because he gave me a funny look. It turned out he had, in fact, decided to start a company called Destination Games. And they went out and landed a publishing deal with NCSoft for something called Tabula Rasa.
Huh.
And then the Privateer Online team quit. And after a while, we landed a deal with Sony Online. And we started pitching new games. And then they said to us, we know we told you get to pitch your own idea, but that wasn't true. We actually wanted you to make Star Wars Galaxies. And that's how I landed up making Star Wars. So yeah, that's kind of the story there and the story of UO2. EA ended up continuing to try, right? Trammel happened in this same time window while I was a little bit, while I was starting Privateer or maybe some of the earlier game ideas before Privateer got greenlit. And it was explicitly, help, we're losing half of the users who touched the game. Literally half. And, I had drifted away from the team at that point. I wasn't on it anymore. And I had been the one who kept saying, we need to find in-game solutions to this problem. But once I was off the team, and once it was a matter, at this point, EverQuest was coming. People knew safe games were coming. And losing half of the people was no longer tolerable. So Trammel went in, and I didn't think it needed to happen, but it did. And you can find, I've written tons of stuff about that. that's out there. But that's also part of the reason why Galaxies used a very different PvP structure from UO in order to avoid that problem from the get-go.
What do you think about the PvP structure in UO?
I don't even know
You
what it looks
remember?
like now.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of, actually the base of it is, believe it or not, some people will swear up and down, it is still to this day the best, most balanced way, to have PvP. It's not overly complicated. It's not item based. It's basically comes down to, yeah, you got to know what you're doing or you don't, and then you team. So now we have, groups. I'm sure you remember back in the day, I think, what was it? Roger Wilco first came out. That changed everything,
Yeah.
right? In
Yes, it did.
PvP. And what that did is voice over IP kind of communication is, everybody can sync drop somebody. I mean, I remember if you could cast like a explosion, then like sync drop like a fireball, you guys were like God way back in the day, just because it was just new. So, like, what do you think about all that?
I think that the biggest problem with UO's PvP system ended up being that it was a system that worked after the fact. And so to get somebody flagged or to signal to a newbie that somebody was a threat came to after they'd already made newbies quit, right? It's like a Reddit system with only downvotes. And its vulnerability was always that people, particularly in a non-item driven game, where it was relatively easy to advance, that meant that a flagged killer could just start over and it wouldn't necessarily be that big a deal. And, that's the same problem that we have with, griefers on Twitter or on Reddit, right? Somebody gets downvoted to oblivion. What do? They make a new handle. And then they're back the very next day just as bad as they used to be. What we did in Galaxies was we created a system that was more opt-in, but tried to preserve that sense of wildness. So you could opt in to being an Imperial or a Rebel. You could opt in to PvP. And even if you didn't opt in permanently, you could basically kind of opt in temporarily. And we leveraged the same idea that we're in UO about criminal flagging, but we called it a temporary enemy flag. And that's actually more or less what WoW ended up with too.
What do you think is better? Like basic, because you've done both now, right? So
I think temporary enemy flagging that starts you safe and moves you to danger is absolutely friendlier for typical users. There's no question, right? Because it means that you're not engaging in motocross before you've learned how to ride a bicycle, right? And the risk is somebody starts out riding a bike and there they are with their training wheels and they get murdered by somebody on a Harley Davidson. And so it's true that that's fairer, but it makes the game less friendly in terms of acquiring users. And the game lives or dies by whether or not users stick with it. That's fundamentally the thing.
Absolutely.
So, the system now, I notice you guys instead use the young system. That's the same idea. It's here's somebody who's safe until they don't need the training wheels anymore, right? And I think that's the critical thing, is that you have to give people a ramp in, because otherwise, they quit disproportionately. Even the temporary enemy flagging in Galaxies, and actually even in early WoW, was still a real issue. When people went to the territory owned by the opposite faction and found themselves getting killed for attacking a PvP flagged mob, they would end up flagged and not know why, right? That is where all of the color coding in UO came from, was the problem that people didn't understand that they were taking actions that would end up flagging them. They didn't know that's what was happening because they were newbies, right? So they didn't understand this was a criminal action. They don't know what that means. So they click and go ahead. Eve went with zone-based safe areas and not. I didn't used to be a fan of safe areas. Now I am. I would do safe areas now. But I would add to it the ability for players to control the safeness of an area. So if somebody colonized a PvP area and made it their own, they could say from now on, this area is safe because we have a player government and we have, you know, magic guards, or we have blaster suppressors, or whatever. They could make it use a criminal system if they chose, and then players could chop up the map themselves. I would have much preferred to do that inside UO than, you know, make Trammel, because then it would have left it all in the hands of the players, and things like that Cazola's Tavern, the City of U, whatever, could still exist, but so could the player killing armies and the naked armies trying to kill them and all the rest in the areas that they claimed as territory. They could make that stuff wild, right? And that would have even made the game into an ever-changing dynamic area, right? So that we weren't stuck with static maps. So that's the direction I would go in today. Safe areas plus the ability for players to control things.
Yeah, I like that answer a lot. I agree with it.
Quick, easy ones. Who came up with power words for spells? They existed in the early Ultima games, but they were from near the beginning, but they were static word combinations. On Legend Mud, we also happened to do word spell combinations. Yeah, so the magic system you ended up with in UO is a hybrid of the old UOs, of the old Ultima system and the Legend Mud magic system. So that's actually where that one came from. That was easy. I just happened to see it scroll by.
Yeah, with that.
Is there any way, like, people can, I mean, there's a few questions of people pre-ordering your new book. Is there any way, is that possible?
It's not up for pre-order yet. I would suggest following me. Follow me on Twitter. I'm at Raph Koster, RAPHKOSTER. I'll definitely announce it there. You can follow me on Facebook as well. I post publicly on Facebook quite a lot of the time. And you can also follow my blog. There's a way to subscribe there, RAPHKOSTER.com. And that'll work just fine. So yeah, any of those is probably the easiest way. We're heading into editing and layout now, so it all depends how long that's going to take. We don't quite know.
That's good.
It'll be on Amazon, I assume.
It will absolutely be on Amazon. It looks like it's going to be 700 pages long. So don't be surprised if it's a little bit pricey. Like a paperback hard print of it is probably still going to have to be like $50+ because it's so big. But I don't know a way around that, unfortunately. I got asked about Legends of Aria. I haven't tried it. They used to be called Shards Online. That isn't why I mentioned that story, but I'm pretty sure that's why they picked the word. That wouldn't surprise me. Most underappreciated feature of UO. Oh, God, I don't know.
I think maybe crafting, right?
Well, crafting isn't underappreciated. I think
it had more. It had a higher ceiling, I feel.
Here's the people forget. No standalone RPGs, other than maybe if you count Ultima 7, okay? Other than that, no RPGs had crafting systems. And just about no online games had crafting systems. It was a thing in some obscure muds, and that was about it. When UO came out with crafting system, Legends of Kesmai ran banner ads on the web that said, "Why play a game to bake bread?" And Shadowbane, which was still in testing, used to run ads that said, "Play to bake bread, why not play to crush?" EverQuest added crafting because of UO. Crafting and things like in WoW today, when you walk around and find herbs, it's because UO put in that feature. And why did UO put in that feature? because we brought it over from the text mods that we were interested in. We had herbalism on Legend Mud. We had a system where you could craft wooden staffs, and we were watching crafting and player economies develop in games like Dark Mud. So it was very specifically a mud-inspired feature. So were things like the theater troops. So were things like the bardic skills. The bardic skills in Legend Mud and the bardic skills on UO went in nearly at the same time, and I coded both of them, and some of the skills are the same. And later on in Galaxies, we put in dancing and all that as a profession. Of course, today, viral videos and MMOs with dancing are common, but that's where a lot of that stuff was born. So, yeah, the influence of UO ended up popping up in odd ways, right? And things like the way Minecraft works today. I have heard that the way Minecraft is in part inspired through a line of descent via Infiniminer and Worm Online, that Minecraft is sort of a, you know, third cousin, twice removed of odd different ways. Dark Age of Camelot, who said that? Armazel was not inspired by a mud. It was literally built by ex-mud guys. Mythic Entertainment had done numerous muds, text-based muds. They used to be a competitor to the Kesmai guys. And the early versions of Dark Age of Camelot were prototyped against their mud engine before it had graphics. So there's a little bit of trivia for you.
What about Shroud of the Avatar? Like, what's your... Do you have any connection there? Or?
No, I don't do anything on Shroud of the Avatar other than cheer them on and wish them luck. At one point, they asked for one of my songs to stick on a bard in some tavern. I don't know if they ever did that or not, but I did send them a piece of music. And, you know, we chat. I'm still friends with Star and Richard. Somebody asked earlier about Richard's castle. My daughter had her baby shower at Richard's castle. It was, in fact, as full of all of the secret passages and crazy shit as you have heard. Unfortunately, that castle the land was sold and that building has been demolished. So it is gone now. I can still draw its map from memory, but it did, in fact, have secret passages into all the bedrooms except one, which was called the safe room. It had an observatory. The principles that underlie the virtues, and it had the tunnels underneath where you could, you know, give yourself a shock on the Tesla coil, meet Pedro the medical skeleton, rub the giant mammoth skull, and all the rest of that. But yeah, it's gone now, unfortunately. All torn down.
With that said, I think we'll draw this near the end here. I'm actually having some connection issues randomly for some reason, but
That's too bad.
but if you want to come back, I mean, anytime, obviously. We'll have you.
That's fine.
Oh no, okay, never mind. We can't end
There
it
we
now.
go. Yeah, we gotta get this.
You know,
Okay.
banjo's not my main instrument. Guitar is.
That doesn't sound like Stones.
No.
Can you
I was
play
trying
Stones on
to-
guitar? Did you ever learn that by chance?
I did.
I used to know it
But,
a long time ago. I don't remember it anymore.
It was a very, very long time ago.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. Believe it or not, I do have a CD on iTunes and Spotify and all that too.
Do you
So you can
really?
find that if you want.
I gotta look that up now for sure. It's on Spotify under Raph Koster.
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't know why we had that music playing in the background waiting before we started this meeting. I should have been playing your album. Jeez.
Yeah, I've long ago, during UO actually, a bunch of my guitar instrumentals were even used on some TV shows and stuff. Yeah, music is my main hobby, and yeah, that's the thing that keeps me sane. So I do a lot of music writing and all of that kind of thing. That's why I keep putting it in the games.
So like
Even when I did my vineyard on Facebook, I did the soundtrack music for that. The background music was me.
Did you do any of the UO actual like music?
Nope.
No, none of that, eh?
None of it.
Have you done any game music? Like there's some epic like you like think about what was it, Diablo 1, you know? Like the old like guitar like you know what I mean?
Yeah, I
like,
did yeah, I did my vineyard was a game, right? So I did the soundtrack music for that. And it was like a mellow piano thing. And I did way more soundtrack for a different Facebook game that came and went so fast nobody saw it. The game was Zynga made almost exactly the same game, so it didn't last. We ended up you know, but that one was full orchestral stuff. But that's about it for the game music mostly. Haven't done too much game music. I mostly end up doing singer-songwriter type stuff.
Do you play live shows ever? Have you ever played?
Very
live shows?
rarely. I did on MetaPlace play a whole bunch of live streamed shows, and you can actually find those on my site. You know, doing covers of all kinds of things. I even covered Thriller, right? I do live covers of stuff on there.
So do you sing as well?
It's a marvelous night for a moon dance, color of stars in your eyes, fantabulous night to make romance, neath the color of October skies. Trees on the leaves are calling, the sound of the breezes that blow, trying to place to the calling. I'll remember the words. Yeah. I sing, I write, I do whatever. I draw. I'm an artsy type.
That's awesome.
Whatever.
Man. That's awesome.
Yeah, I love it.
Anyway, it's dinner time.
Good. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
really,
we can,
really appreciate it.
We can cut it off there, and if you want to revisit us in, you know, hopefully like probably after your book's out, maybe if you want to do something like that. I want to read it first though, so I know what the heck I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
But
700 pages. A huge amount of it is material from the blog because it is selected essays. People who want to read more about UO history, click the UO tag on my blog and they'll find just piles of stuff. But I went back and tried to fill in holes. So the book has like almost 100,000 new words worth of postmortem stuff in it, like the complete history of UO player killing and all the systems we tried and how they worked, stuff like that. So yeah, all of that is there.
Perfect. With that said, thank all you guys, especially thank Raph Koster. I mean, I was just messaging Epi here. I was like, this one, like, it's well, I wasn't expecting all that. So my mind's blown. If my mind's blown, I can assure you that our players are just like, wow, like people weren't expecting that. Like, it's insane. I can't thank you enough, Raph. I mean, yeah.
Sure.
For coming
I do kind of want to, before we go, I want a show of hands from the crowd in there, and for that matter on Twitch. How many of you were in the beta? Anybody?
The UO beta?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wasn't even in that, actually. You were, Joe? I wasn't.
Yes. Yeah.
I was in Second Age.
Yeah, I drove to Nashville. Well, my mom took me to Nashville 2 hours away to buy it the week after it came out.
Yeah, me, my buddy Ross, and Devin, the ones that got me into UOF in the first place, were on the beta.
Awesome. So those are people who actually remember Designer Dragon, which is cool.
Yeah, and that's you. Yeah.
That was me.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you very much. We're going to end the stream here. And thank you guys. Until next time.
Right.
Thank you all for playing the game after all of these years.
It was super awesome talking to you earlier.
It's super flattering.
This is awesome.
Yeah, this is amazing. Yeah, you know, people dream about talking with the designers and developers, and you know, you're one of the names that kind of, you know, a lot of people don't know just how much you had your hands on to mold Ultima Online. And so I'm really happy that people are, you know, once they hear about this, they're like, wow, you know, and I'm I'm really happy that we're able to do that. So thank you again.
I make these kinds of games because they build things like this.
Absolutely.
That's why I do it. So
it's amazing. Thank you very much. See you guys later.
Bye.